All right, so this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the cash conversion cycle. So the cash conversion cycle is basically measuring the length of time or the delay between when a company pays for inventory and when they actually collect the receivable that was generated when they sold the inventory. So we actually have a couple pieces here. So the first piece we're going to look at is the average age of inventory. So this is basically looking at from the moment the inventory comes into my business's possession until it is ultimately sold, how long does that take? And to calculate that, basically what we have is the inventory amount, so the amount that we actually have in inventory, and then we're going to divide that by cost of goods sold per day. Now, this is a bit of an approximation here, in that the inventory that we have on account could actually incorporate partially constructed goods, things like that, that would have had their costs have changed, not just from what I paid my supplier. But it's about as close of an approximation as we're going to get unless we have access to a lot more data. So when I look at cost of goods sold per day, what we're looking at is essentially if I have, let's say, $1 million of cost of goods sold per day, and I have $10 million in inventory, what that basically means is my average age of inventory is 10 days because basically, if I have $10 million in inventory, if I'm selling about $1 million worth a day, it would take me 10 days to essentially sell out all of my inventory. Hence, my inventory is essentially on average 10 days old. Now, importantly, that doesn't actually mean we ever necessarily sell out. It just means that we're kind of computing, given the amount I have in inventory and the rate at which I am selling, kind of how many days worth of sales is sitting there in inventory. And that gives me an estimate of roughly on average how old that inventory is going to be. Now, from the moment that I sell it, there's that length of time before I actually get paid that's going to happen if I am extending credit. So what we need to factor in now is from the moment I sell it to the time I actually get paid, we have a delay due to the fact that I, in many cases as a business, extend credit to my customers. So now we have to look at the average collection period. So the average collection period, or days sales outstanding, this is how long it takes from when I sell it to when I actually get paid. So to find that, what we're going to calculate is we're going to take our sales per day. So that's basically how much on average I'm selling per day. And I'm going to take my receivables and divide it by that sales per day. And basically what that's telling me is how many days worth of receivables I have, or sorry, how many days worth of sales I have sitting in receivables. So let's suppose I had $100 million of receivables and I had $10 million of sales per day, really crazy high numbers, right? So if I had $100 million of receivables, $10 million of sales per day, then what would happen in that case would be I would take the 100 divided by 10 and my average collection period would be 10. And that would mean that on average, it's taking me 10 days to collect relative to my sales. Now, that doesn't actually necessarily mean that every single one's taking 10 days. It's just a broad aggregate. And there is something that's kind of worth noting as it relates to this particular ratio. For the receivables here, I'm trying to figure out how much I've got in receivables relative to what I'm selling on account. Ideally, what I would have here in the denominator would not be total sales, but sales on account, which could be quite a bit different. However, most of the time, companies don't actually disclose that. And so since we don't know what the actual total amount of sales on account would be, we often will be stuck sort of using sales. Now, if we're using sales, if you think about this, the highest sales on account would be to be equal to sales. And that would mean that if I'm using sales, I'm using a higher number here than probably is accurate, which means it's going to look like I'm collecting faster than I really am. So if I really actually had sales on account, I'd have a smaller number because sales on account is going to be a subset of total sales, right? So sales on account would give me a smaller denominator, which would mean it would actually look like it's taking me longer to collect. So something to kind of keep in mind, if a business has substantial sales that are not on account, and I'm calculating this average collection period using total sales, probably it's actually taking me a fair bit longer to collect than this ratio would tend to suggest. Now, the next piece that we need to factor in is this. When I order inventory and the inventory arrives in my business, that's not actually the moment that I've paid for it. Because what we're trying to get at is that length of time or delay between when we've paid for the inventory and we've collected the receivables. So I've got this average age of inventory. That's from when the inventory arrives in my business to when I sell it. Then I got the average collection period from when I sell it to when I actually get paid. but I didn't actually pay, most likely, at the moment that I actually had that inventory arrive in my business, because I probably bought on account. And if I bought on account, then we need to factor in how long I waited to pay. And that's where we get the average payment period, or the payables deferral period. To find that, we're going to take our payables, so our accounts payable, and we're going to divide that by cost of goods sold per day. Now, the reality is that cost of goods sold per day probably factors in whatever else I did to that inventory. If I made some other product out of it and I put in extra costs associated with that, which is a bit different from what I actually ordered. But the reality is, again, when I'm on the outside looking in and I'm looking at a company's financial statements, they generally don't tell me the actual amount of all the invoice costs when I bought these materials from the supplier. So cost of goods sold is essentially the best I can do. So if I'm looking at cost of goods sold divided by 365, I'm getting cost of goods sold per day. And then I'm looking at my payables divided by my cost of goods sold per day. So if my cost of goods sold per day is 1 million and I have $20 million of payables, I would take 20 million over 1 million of cost of goods sold per day. I have 20 days worth of payables sitting, or 20 days worth of cost of goods sold sitting in payables. And basically what that's telling me is, on average, it's taking me 20 days to pay. So when I start putting this all together, what we're trying to get at, again, is that length of time or delay between when I have paid and then when I have collected. So to do that, let's kind of take this a step further. I can look at the operating cycle. The operating cycle is the average age of inventory plus the average collection period. In other words, how long it takes from when the inventory arrives to when I sell it, plus from when I sell it to when I get paid. Okay, that's the operating cycle. However, to get to the cash conversion cycle, I'm going to take that operating cycle, but I'm going to subtract how long I waited to pay. So let's suppose my average, let's say that my overall inventory cycle here is, let's say 20 days. Let's say my average collection period is 30 days. So if I take 20 days plus 30 days, that would give me 50 days, right? So 20 plus 30 would be 50. So my operating cycle would be 50. But if I wait to pay my supplier 25 days, then I don't have my money tied up for 50 days. I'm going to have 50 minus the 25 I waited to pay my supplier. And the result is going to be my money is actually tied up in this, or my net delay is 25 days. So the net delay from when I dispersed funds to pay for the inventory to when I ultimately received it back would be 25 in this example. Okay. Now, and again, basically that's a function of that average age of inventory, the average collection period. So average age of inventory, how long that inventory is sort of living in my business before I sell it, average collection period from when I sold it to when I get paid. And then that payables deferral period is from when I bought it to when I actually disperse the funds to pay for it. Okay. So what does all of this mean? Well, a shorter cash conversion cycle is basically beneficial because it means that less of my money is going to be tied up in this process. So if I had a cash conversion cycle of 50 days, that means my money is tied up in these short-term assets of inventory and receivables for 50 days. If I can get that cash conversion cycle down to 40, I only have that money tied up for 40 days. If I can get it down to 10, I only have that money tied up for 10 days, which means I can reuse it in 10 days, which means I don't have to have as much sitting in inventories or receivables. And as I've discussed in a prior video, money that is sitting in current assets is kind of unproductive and doesn't necessarily make us a lot of money. So from that standpoint, it makes sense. To try to minimize that cash conversion cycle. But that leads to an interesting question. That is, can this be negative? What would that mean? Is that even possible? So here's a way that could be possible. What if my average age of inventory is, say, 40 days? My average collection period is basically 0. What if I don't sell on account? So if I got 40 days here, my average collection period is 0 because I don't sell on account. So my operating cycle is 40 days. But then what if I wait to pay my supplier 50 days? So my operating cycle is 40. My delay in paying the supplier is 50. I would get a negative 10. What does that mean? What that basically means is I get the item from my supplier, I sell it, get the cash, and I do all of that 10 days before I've even paid the supplier for the goods, which means I get to use all that money that belongs to the supplier for 10 days. Now, as long as I'm not missing discounts, which will be a topic of a subsequent video, as long as I'm not missing discounts, basically that means I get to use that money that actually is the supplier's money, potentially for free for 10 days, which is potentially extremely beneficial. Now, if I wind up missing discounts, that's maybe a whole other story, but that'll be a topic in a subsequent video. So it is possible for the cash conversion cycle to be negative, and that basically means I don't even have my money tied up in inventory or receivables. I have my supplier's money tied up in it, and I even get paid before I've ever paid the supplier for all the stuff he gave me. So that means I get to potentially use that money for a little bit of a longer period. Generally, that's not going to be real possible for many companies, though occasionally there are some companies that have pulled that off. Now, that does bring up an interesting discussion as it relates to kind of permanent versus seasonal funding. So notice that we do have money that's typically going to be tied up in these inventories and these receivables. And that's potentially going to fluctuate throughout the year. But for a normal business, we're just going to have some amount of money that is basically tied up in inventory and receivables all the time. And the idea there would be, well, we could use permanent funding for that. I could use long-term liabilities, shareholders' equity, things like that to fund that, because I always have to have this. I mean, I always have to have inventory in there. And to kind of see that at some level, think of your local grocery store or something of that nature. They always, barring crazy pandemic scenarios, have all kinds of stuff on their shelves. And because they have all kinds of stuff on the shelves, basically on an ongoing basis, the specific canned good might change, but there are always cans there. And so the idea is that's sort of like a permanent current asset. And so you could use a permanent source of funding for that. Now, some businesses have significant seasonal effects. So maybe they sell a whole lot at Christmas time, maybe toy companies. So if they have a very strong seasonal effect, then in that case, the amount of inventories and receivables, things like that, could spike dramatically at certain times of year, which would mean they might need significantly more funding during certain times of year than at other times. And that leads to kind of a question. Well, if I've got a seasonal component to the funding, how do I handle that? The permanent component, I probably ought to just use long-term funding for. But what do I do with the seasonal? The aggressive approach to seasonal funding would be to use short-term debt to fund it. Now, here's why that's aggressive. Because if things don't go well, you're in trouble. Because if you're using short-term debt, that debt has to be paid soon, and that's going to come due. And if you haven't actually had success selling the inventory you were planning to sell in that window, you could have a liquidity problem and run into trouble actually paying it. The more conservative approach would be to use long-term funding, so long-term debt or equity for both the seasonal and the permanent needs, so that basically, if sales don't materialize right at the moment, it's not a big deal. I don't have to pay this debt in the next 3 months. It doesn't mean I like the loss of sales, but it does mean that I'm not under a huge amount of pressure to make the sales happen. And that's why it's more conservative. Now, in general, if you think about kind of this cash conversion cycle, and if having a shorter cash conversion cycle is beneficial, it leads to an interesting question, which would be, well, how exactly could we shorten this? Well, if we look at the pieces there, average age of inventory, one way of shortening that would be to have less inventory on hand so that I have a smaller average age of inventory. Downside of that is I run the higher risks of running out if somebody wants to place big orders because I don't have a lot of inventory on hand. So there's some challenges there. Average collection period. Well, what if I don't sell an account? If I don't sell an account, I get paid immediately. So that shrinks a lot. The downside of that is we're losing sales because I don't sell an account. So there's a trade-off there. I could also try to shorten this cash conversion cycle by increasing the amount of the accounts payable that are outstanding. Okay. So basically, if I increase that so I pay later, then that might actually mean that I kind of have a shorter cash conversion cycle, right? By paying later for my supplier. The downside there is if I pay a lot later, I might potentially miss discounts. And as I'll discuss in a subsequent video, missing discounts is actually a potentially very expensive proposition. So I don't necessarily want to miss discounts. So generally, I want the cash conversion cycle to be shorter. And the way I could do it would be have less inventory, collect faster on my receivables, pay my supplier later. But there are some kind of limits around those that you have to be careful about. Okay, hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.